Hey, good morning. It's Patricia Murphy. It's Thursday. This is Seattle Now. Workers at a number of big Seattle companies are trying to unionize, and some are succeeding. It got us wondering if unions are making a comeback in the U.S. after decades of decline. Historian Margaret O'Mara will help us answer that question in a minute. But first, let's get you caught up. Amazon is rethinking its bricks and mortar strategy and closing 68 retail stores. The company will close Amazon bookstores and a handful of other locations that sell toys and home goods in the U.S. and the U.K. The spots were an experiment to bring online shopping into the real world with touches like reviews alongside products. Amazon Retail Grocery will stand. The company owns more than 500 Whole Foods stores, and it's planning an apparel store in L.A. where an algorithm suggests what clothing you should try on. The city has its next chief librarian. Yesterday, the Seattle Public Library Board picked Tom Fay to lead the system. He's been filling in on the job since April last year and has been with SPL since 2015. Fay told the board he first got into library work as a teenager, making $3.25 an hour at his local branch in rural Nevada. And it's not just us here at Seattle Now celebrating a birthday. We turned 2 yesterday, in case you missed it. The J-Pod of endangered resident killer whales welcomed a new calf this week. Hello, J59. The Center for Whale Research confirmed the new calf on Tuesday and say it looks healthy. It's the first calf to be born in J-Pod since September 2020.
Heavier workloads, delayed breaks, and shortage of personal protective equipment. Just some of the concerns detailed by Starbucks employees who have now expanded their union push to nearly 20 states. Let's bring in Yahoo Finance.
Workers over at REI are attempting to unionize, and the CEO is not too happy about it. Now, this is
for the first time ever, hundreds of Google workers have come together to form a union, and they say it's been years in the making.
Amazon workers at its Bessemer, Alabama warehouse are about to vote again on whether to join a union. Last year, about 71% of the employees decided against joining a union. However, the NLRB said Amazon violated labor law during the vote and ordered a new election.
Is it just me, or does it seem like unions are in the news a lot these days? Starbucks workers have unionized at 3 stores. They're holding votes at more than 100 other spots around the country, including here in Seattle. And as we are recording this episode, an REI store in New York is counting ballots in their union election. And you can't ignore that a lot of these companies are right here in Seattle. Margaret O'Mara is here to answer our questions about what's fueling this push. She's a historian and UW professor specializing in the technology industry and American politics. Hey, Margaret, really good to have you back.
It's great to be back. Thanks for having me.
Sure. First things first. Are these stories about workers at Starbucks, Amazon, and REI unionizing part of a broader labor movement, or is this really just a coincidence?
It's not a coincidence. I think it is part of a broader upsurge and a broader consciousness, not a singular movement. These are very different employers. What employees are bringing to the table, what they're asking for is different. But I think it is a shared, let's call it a zeitgeist, something that has tipped over, that was brewing before the pandemic, but perhaps the last 2 years accelerated that. And we're seeing that manifest now.
I love that you used the word zeitgeist because that is exactly what it feels like right now. Let's talk about why this moment is occurring. Workers at these places are talking about a lot of issues they want to address, including pay, staff shortages, and workplace safety. But not liking your job is actually nothing new. What is pushing people to this point to say, I'm just not taking it anymore?
Yeah, well, I think that what we're seeing is additional worker empowerment that's coming from a number of directions. One is simply the shared experience, the collective experience of the last 2 years, in which everyone's work was changed and disrupted. But some American workers got to, including within tech companies, white collar workers got to work from home, but also there were others who weren't able to work from home, where health and safety and possible exposure to COVID-19 became a critical workplace issue. And the willingness of companies, particularly ones that have been doing extremely well, workers are saying you aren't sharing that wealth with us in terms of our pay and benefits, and also, in some cases, putting us in danger on the front lines and not respecting our need to be safe as you are.
And again, this backdrop of the pandemic just created this singular moment for people when all of a sudden everything was on the table and people were reassessing things about their lives. You can't ignore that shift in perspective in this movement.
You can't. And I think it's happening in two dimensions, right? It's not just compensation, what you earn, but it's also quality of job. And those two things, while we have seen hourly wages go up, notably Amazon fulfillment centers starting at $15 an hour. Remember, let's dial back a few years when the fight for 15, which started here in Seattle, was really pushing the outer limits of the possible, right? And now that's becoming much more common. And in Amazon fulfillment centers, the hourly wages are higher than that in many cases. They are really shifting the job market, regional job market, in many places where they are a major employer now. But that is not enough, right? That is something that if these workers who are organizing, whether it be at fulfillment centers or in other companies, are saying, we need more. And we see this really vividly in a company like Google, for example, where those activists are, in many cases, extremely well paid, well compensated, white collar Google employees. These are people who historically have not been unionized. It's white collar private sector employees have had, even at the high point of unionization in the middle of the 20th century, you didn't see private sector unions of managerial employees because this was management. They weren't rank and file. So it's really something to watch, and it's new.
Setting aside the pandemic for a minute, the power of labor has been declining for decades. I want to look at the bigger picture here. Is there a bigger labor movement that has been brewing?
Yeah, well, we did have a remarkable few decades in the middle part of the 20th century. Remarkable in this was a departure from form, in a way, a kind of exceptional moment that rather than the norm in American labor history, when unions, particularly in large manufacturing industries like autos and steel, had very, very high levels of membership among the manufacturing workforce, and real incomes went up. Between the late 40s and the early 70s, the wages of rank and file workers, they went up by over 60%. There was a real meaningful upward mobility. Most of those workers were manufacturing sector workers. One of the interesting dimensions now is that the economy is very different. A blue-collar worker or a working-class person has a very different kind of job. But what's been brewing for a long time has been the insecurity, instability of working-class jobs, service sector jobs, to deliver a living wage, much less a family wage. And that insecurity is something that has been prevalent for many decades. But now there are, workers too are more empowered now because they're more in demand. Employers need, have a chronic labor shortage. So the great resignation, whatever you might call it, has empowered workers who previously didn't feel that they had the ability to push back.
So many fascinating truths revealed about ourselves during the pandemic, Margaret. Let's talk a little bit about the companies that have been in the headlines around this. Starbucks, of course, a big one, Amazon, and now REI. Also, some of the tech companies like Apple and Google. Do you see a pattern among which employers are experiencing this swell of unionization effort?
Well, this is another really interesting dimension because all of the companies you just named have been companies that distinguish themselves as treating their workers better than, right? Starbucks famously giving health benefits to their frontline workers, their baristas et al., that other comparable retailers did not. REI, a cooperative. This is a very, it really has its roots in a very pro-worker moment in Seattle history. The broken promise element is really interesting here across these movements, that this is not simply a matter of, we knew you were a bad guy and now we're going to push you on it. We thought you were the good guys and we'd like you to be better.
And a lot of employees went to work for these companies. Maybe these are not long-term jobs, but went into them thinking that possibly they could be because this was a solid company. So you would come in as a barista or a warehouse worker and maybe stay, even though maybe those jobs aren't necessarily designed that way because these were supposedly better companies to work for.
I think that's right. I think this promise of upward mobility, but also, this is something that employers, this is consistent over time, have tried to, employers don't like a unionized workforce generally. It's more difficult to do business when you have a union that's pushing against the things you as a company would like to do. And it limits flexibility. So employers instead will give other benefits, will emphasize culture. We're a family. There's a potential for upward mobility and opportunity within this company to foster loyalty that not only improves morale and team building and productivity, but also it is soft power. It is designed to keep everyone on the same side and not be in an adversarial management versus rank and file relationship, which is certainly the way that tech companies have understood themselves since the very beginning, since the earliest days of Silicon Valley, when these early companies like Hewlett Packard were saying, we don't want unionized workers. We're going to give people stock options instead. And that's going to be a way to keep us all on the same side.
The response from these companies to unionization efforts has also made the news. The first vote at Amazon's Bessemer warehouse, which was unsuccessful, was overturned because Amazon unduly influenced the election. Now, again, not surprising, companies don't want workers to unionize, but it also doesn't seem like it's just going to blow over. So how do you see this ending?
Yeah, there's a great deal of momentum here. And, while we don't know what the future portends, I think we can look back to the early 20th century where mass unionization occurred after many, many years, decades of efforts by workers to organize, and really gains momentum and a foothold in the 1930s with federal recognition of workers' right to organize. And employers also agreed to it, not enthusiastically, but realized that this was pretty critical in order to not only reduce turnover, to maintain productivity, but also to avoid even more, prolonged strikes are never good for business, and also the even more kind of political unrest and class warfare. This was in the Great Depression, that wasn't out of the realm of possibility. So crisis moments can be a clarifying moments. The pandemic era is definitely a crisis. It has had a lot of twists and turns that have been unexpected, but it's hard to put this genie back in the bottle now.
Lots of shifts in the labor force. Really appreciate your insight. Margaret O'Mara, historian and University of Washington professor. Appreciate it.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to Seattle Now. Clare McGrane produced today's show. Matt Jorgensen does our theme music. I'm Patricia Murphy. See you tomorrow.